We've never seen that copy more before.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Have they ever been to SS before?
We're still going? Yep. I welcome representatives from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Mr. Carmody, I'll let you fill your water glass, and then I'll ask you if you've got an opening statement.
I have, Chair. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take your time.
Thank you. Shane Carmody, Chief Executive Officer of the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to make a short opening statement. I'd like to update the committee on three topical areas of the Civil Aviation Safety Authority before we move on to questions. I wanted to begin by reiterating that CASA in its current form was established with a focus being first and foremost on aviation safety. This stemmed from the tragic Monarch and Seaview accidents in 1993 and 1994, respectively, when the then Civil Aviation Authority, the regulator, our predecessor, was found to have failed in its safety responsibility by placing commercial considerations ahead of the safety of passengers. I don't want this to occur again. One of the three topics I'll mention today is the significant progress CASA has made on the finalisation of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations. The journey began in around 1995 with 55 regulations to be made. By 2010 there were 17 left. By 2016 there were 10 left. Last year we completed 7, so we have 3 regulations left before calling an end to the regulatory development program. Put another way, we're 95% complete, but with a lot of work done last year. On remotely piloted aircraft systems, it's another topic I'd like to mention. One of the recommendations of the References Committee last year related to establishing a registration system and a competence test for RPAS, or drones. We released a policy proposal on the 25th of January this year for consultation on registration of drones, including an online education course, and the consultation closes today. As of this morning, we've received over 4,100 responses, which is the most we've had in relation to one consultation ever, as far as I can recall. As per our practice, once this consultation closes, we evaluate the responses to determine if any amendments need to be made to our proposal. We will then publish a summary of consultation and the comments approved for publication and make the necessary changes to our regulations. At this stage, we're aiming to introduce RPA registration for RPA operator certificate holders from the 1st of July, registration and accreditation for the excluded category from the 1st of September, and registration for RPA or recreational RPA operators from the 1st of November this year. We're also continuing to work on the other areas outlined in the report. The third item I'd like to mention today is the recent changes to community service flights. To be clear, these changes are about community service flights, that is, flights conducted by volunteer pilots, free of charge, and coordinated by a third party. They're not about emergency services, not about aerial ambulance or aeromedical flights. These changes are not trying to close down the valued service the CSF organisations offer the rural and regional communities. On the contrary, we are trying to fulfil our mandate by making certain these flights are as safe as possible, noting that it is unreasonable to assume members of the public who accept charitable medical flights would have a meaningful awareness of the resulting increased potential for exposure to risks that may be associated with these flights, the pilot's experience level, or the airworthiness status of the aircraft. It is our view that community service flights, particularly those arranged, coordinated or brokered by Angel Flight, have an accident incident rate significantly higher than private operations. Given this, I've acted in the interest of aviation safety to raise the minimum standards for pilots operating these flights. One final point, since consultation closed on the community service flights discussion paper and instrument, and I signed the instrument that imposes conditions on licences for pilots wishing to conduct community service flights, I've had a number of additional representations regarding the restriction of rotary wing aircraft in community service flight activities. After considering the feedback, I acknowledge that the consequences might be to limit the field of potential CSF volunteers. Limiting potential community service flight volunteers was not my intention. Given this, I have an instrument being prepared to amend the current instrument and include rotary wing operations, which I will lodge in accordance with appropriate parliamentary process. Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you very much.
Senator, I'm happy for Senator
Patrick.
Patrick to draw.
Thank you.
I've got a few questions, but you can kick off.
Okay, I might just ask a few questions. I'm not sure if you listened, Mr Carmody, to the testimony in, I think it was Brisbane, I was last week, into rural and regional airfares.
No, Senator, I didn't.
Okay.
I did see a transcript of somewhere which I skimmed through, but I wasn't even aware at the time, Senator.
Okay, so there were a couple of issues that were raised that, and no, I'm not directing this at you in any way, shape or form, but really after a response of some sort. One of them was in relation to a High Court case that has just passed, Work Health Authority versus Outback Ballooning Limited. So you're
I'm
aware
familiar
of the
with that,
case?
Senator. That High Court handed down its decision a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Now, it's been, and I know that I won't be critical of the High Court. They define the law as it is. I note that Justice Edelman made a very, very forceful dissenting judgment, but the rest of the justices basically have ruled that personnel operating an aircraft need to comply not just with CASA regulations but with local work health and safety regulations. Mr Alec, I presume that's a reasonable summation.
Senator, Dr Alec is probably
sorry.
much more of an expert on it than I am,
Yep.
Senator, but it was a co-jurisdictional arrangement, I suppose, in my mind.
Sure.
That's the best way to describe it.
Okay. There's been an immediate expression by industry that creates a significant problem for them because now, particularly in relation to someone who's flying from Queensland and then to South Australia and then on to Western Australia, they're now burdened with 3 different regulatory requirements imposed upon them by the states. I'm wondering whether CASA's view, noting we don't really want to impose regulations unnecessarily on pilots and aircraft operators, whether CASA will will review that decision and make some recommendations in respect of that decision, noting that anything that's passed in the federal parliament by way of section 109 of the Constitution could override that High Court decision.
Sure. Thank you. Jonathan Alec, Executive Manager, Legal and Regulatory Affairs. Senator, your summary was accurate. I think there's a risk, not so much in what you've had to say, but in the perception that it overstates matters to some extent. The High Court decision, the majority decision, basically held that there is room for both aviation legislation and work health and safety regulation in that space, so long as there's no direct inconsistency between the two. And what the case decided was that there was no what they call field exclusion or indirect inconsistency issue. So the mere fact that the civil aviation legislation governs activities in the aviation operational environment would preclude the ability for any state work health and safety legislation or other legislation for that matter to be involved. Prior to 2011 and to some extent after that was the situation. And I'm not aware of any huge controversies that arose about the coextensive jurisdiction of work health and safety authorities and civil aviation. We're certainly mindful of that judgment, and we were watching those proceedings very carefully and very closely, if for no other reason than because, certainly in our experience, there are areas in which CASA is not really properly equipped or designed to be regulating. I mean, I won't go into hypothetical examples, but the initial case in 2011 involved an injury or death, I believe, that occurred within the cockpit of an aircraft, an operational environment without any question. The Outback case involved something quite different, where it was a passenger embarking on a commercial balloon flight, an area where CASA could and in fact did have regulatory responsibilities and had imposed them most appropriately on that operator. There are a whole host of other areas, however, where those lines can become increasingly blurry pilot, it's somewhat fanciful, I suppose, but a pilot who slips on a banana peel in the dispatch room, operational environment. Is that something CASA should be regulating? We were talking about, in some of these flights when you have to get off the plane and go in a little bus from the aircraft back to the terminal, we speculated, well, what if a passenger became overcome with fumes in that transport vehicle? Would that be a CASA regulatory issue? Would there be something else? So we feel that in the absence of really most extraordinary circumstances where there would almost certainly be a direct inconsistency anyway, that there is room for co-jurisdiction here. We have done and we will continue to work with work health and safety authorities. In fact, we've already arranged to meet with their national organization in April to talk about the implications of this decision, to try and ensure that we don't undercut or override one another's jurisdiction.
Okay, can I invite you to have a look at on notice, to have a look at the Alliance Airlines testimony, because they stated a concern, and I would appreciate their concern they provided an example of a passenger boarding an aircraft, whether or not that was the start or the end of a navigation which is exclusively a Commonwealth jurisdiction, whether or not there's some way of, with the Commonwealth law, to draw the line so it extended to common laws for pilots and aircraft operators as they go from state to state. There would be benefit in that, in making sure that you don't have a pilot who has to now get their mind across all sorts of legislation depending on the state in which they're flying into or out of.
Right. Well, first of all, I have actually seen that testimony.
You have?
I'm aware of those issues,
Yeah.
and I'm alive to the concerns
Sure.
they have. They're not fanciful. By the same token, those are realities with which operators have been dealing for years.
Yeah, but we can make it easy for them.
Oh, look, that's part of the reason we're going to meet with the work
yeah.
health and safety authorities. We don't want to create situations that
and
complicate
I would hope
matters.
industry as well. You might consult with industry about their concerns in relation to it.
Well, we
Was it-
consult with all of those with whom we're meant to consult with. This is an initial meeting with work health and safety because these are the two jurisdictions that now will be looking at each
Sure.
other more closely. But your points are well taken.
You're aware of the new bill that's entered into the Parliament in relation to changing the Act.
I'm
which
aware of the
governs
bill,
it.
Senator, yes.
And consistent with the theme that amendment is intended to invoke. Once again, we're trying to reduce the regulatory burden on the industry.
Right.
The other decision that we were alerted to, the committee was alerted to, was the decision in CASA versus CAPA Proprietary Limited, and they basically said that Regulation 206 B, which defines charter operations, that there was going to be a rationalisation across basically private, commercial. Currently we have then charter, then regular public transport or licences. The latter of those two are going to be combined, is my understanding. And the question, which I think was reasonably asked, or we were asked to put to CASA, is, as you combine the RPT licence requirements and the charter licence requirements, will that end up, the fear is that will cause the charter operators to have to operate to a higher level of regulation than they currently do to meet. How are you going to handle that, basically?
Well, as far as the operational differences are concerned, there are others who can speak to that more effectively than I can. But the questions that were raised in those proceedings last week, I find myself in the extraordinary position of agreeing with what Mr. Martin said, and that is that the problem will be solved and has been solved now with the introduction of Parts 1 19, 121, and 135, which do what Mr. Martin said they would do. You no longer have to go through this extraordinary, tortuous process of determining whether occupation in the aircraft or accommodation in the aircraft is available to persons generally. Now it's simply a question of whether it's a large aircraft or a small aircraft engaged in a passenger transport operation. So that particular problem that was addressed in CAPER will go away when these pieces of legislation come into force in 2021.
And Senator, if I may, part of the intention, and I think it's been a long-standing intention of governments, has been to reduce the distinction between charter and regular public transport operations, to reduce that distinction, which means closing the gap between the two. I don't believe it was ever the intention to reduce the standards, the safety standards in regular public transport. It was always the long-standing intention to assist charter to get closer to that safety standard. And that's one of the things that's come out of these regulations. But I take the point on regulatory burden, but I also understand the point, that very long-standing strategic objective for a very long time of trying to reduce that gap.
Yeah.
Segueing into regulatory burden, my understanding is you've got a plain English regulation program in train. Can you provide some details on that?
Yes, certainly we have, Senator. We've been concerned for some time, for a long time, that the regulations are very complex. They're very hard to read. The way they are drafted is in accordance with government drafting standards. So the Office of Parliamentary Counsel drafts them in such a way that says essentially it is an offence if you do any of the following things, which takes you through the offences before you get to what it is that they really want you to do. We've been concerned about that for a while, and I had discussions with OPC about changing the drafting style, but they were unsuccessful. So discussions internally in the organisation, we've been working on drafting a plain English guide to see whether we could turn that discussion around to a positive affirmation of what it is that you want to do. If you want to fly in this sort of aircraft, if you want to fly in an aircraft as a pilot, you need to have the following things with you. Yep. You need to do this, you need to do this. So we've actually drafted the first stage of general operating and flight rules, plain English guide. We were going to launch it at Avalon next week for consultation. And it's.
I won't spoil it by asking you to table it, okay? So.
But in the document itself, we've said we're asking feedback on the full plain English guide. We want pilots to understand the rules, and if they think this will work, then my intent is to roll it out across not necessarily all of the regulations because they may not need it, but a lot of the regulations, so that we'll end up with a plain English guide that you can just grab. A little bit like a road rules guide that when you are learning to drive a car, you don't have to go and learn all of the, you don't have to go to the Act. You can go to a book that explains what you're supposed to do. That's our intent.
In those circumstances, and this is just something I was thinking about, and I will declare you gave me a private briefing on some of these issues the other day. What happens in the instance where the regulations and the plain English guide are interpreted differently or cause a problem, and it ends up in a court, which I suspect will look to the regulations and not to the guide?
Senator, I hope to avoid that. What I've done so far, okay. What we've done so far is we've drafted, we've tried to turn the drafting model on its head and drafted something, and then we are working it through our legal and regulatory affairs area to be absolutely certain that what is reflected in the plain English guide actually reflects the intent of the regulation, even though it's turned around the other way. And so far we've been successful. I think that there is still some concern. This is not an easy thing to do. There's still some concern that it's going to be challenging, and that's why we've done the first things on Part 91 to see whether it does actually work. So far, there's nothing in the draft plain English guide that we're putting out that is inconsistent with its parent Part 91. So we've actually made it work in this circumstance, and I think that that if I use the road rules example again, I would assume that what I'm reading in the road rules when I'm learning to drive is absolutely consistent with the road rules of the state that I'm in, and that if I followed that guide, I would in fact be operating consistent with the rules. So I'm alert. We're alert to it. In fact, we've had numerous discussions about it, but as we try and work our way through. But at this stage, we're confident that we can get ourselves there. But it'll depend a bit on the feedback. We might find that industry doesn't like it and they like to stay with what they've got. I'd be surprised.
Sure. Okay. So, all right. We'll see how that pans out. I do note your office provided me with also a copy of your visual flight rules guide. I presume that's not public yet, or it is, or
That's an update. I think it's an update. It is public. Yes.
okay, it is public.
Visual flight guide, and we have a very large, a broad responsibility for education. It's one of the things that we do, and so we are publishing a human factors guide at Avalon as well, which leads us. Which we think will be very helpful for pilots at all levels. The more experienced pilots, of course, do a lot of human factors training in airlines. But as you work your way back down to the smaller end of town, there's sometimes a lack of awareness, and we're moving to that space as well. Hopefully in cooperation with the community service flight organisations and a range of others. The Airline Operators and Pilots Association, we've reached out to them and said that we'd like to work closely with them in promoting human factors and those sorts of things.
I've got a pilot's license. I'm wondering whether I should declare this as a gift of some sort. I haven't flown for 20 years, so hopefully I'll get away.
Have to check and see what we sell them for. So.
Okay. Let's move to the perhaps more contentious issue, which is the Angel flight, the community service flights.
Community service flights.
And I'm very glad to hear that you're now going to modify the regulations to allow helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
We did talk about this in our meeting the other day. I still have some difficulties with the regulations, and I just want to work through that
Certainly.
publicly with you. So the regulations seek to change a number of things, and I note these regulations have, in a briefing you provided me, and I think to the committee, stem from two accidents that have taken place, one in Victoria, one in South Australia, Mount Gambier in South Australia.
I'd say they do directly, but the connection between the actual accidents themselves is indirect. But in terms of raising the standard in the sector, there's a direct relationship, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because I've read the ATSB report for the Victorian incident, mm-hmm. and of course I can't for the Mount Gambier incident because the ATSB has not finished its work.
It's now in the draft interested parties stage, Senator. So the report has been released to me to look at as an interested party, but I'm not allowed to share the contents, and to Angel Flight.
Sure.
And also to the families of those involved, and there are probably a couple of other interested parties. But it's now in a phase of, I think it's 6 weeks of discussion before they finalise their report.
Okay. So in both, just going through the regulations as you are changing them. So one of the changes you're placing upon pilots who may participate in this is a minimum number of hours. I think it's 400 hours experience and 200 in command.
250 in command.
250 command.
400 hours minimum, unless you hold a commercial pilot's licence or an air transport pilot's licence, which you can get in less hours, but which is a much more structured training program to get you to that point. Okay. So it's the 400 hours tends to relate more to private pilots. Private flying, which is an experiential base, but not as much a structured training course.
But I note that those requirements are firstly not related to either of the accidents that have taken place, in both of those cases, those pilots had substantially more experience than the 250-hour minimum requirement that you've
Or the
placed in
400.
this regulation.
The 400.
Yeah.
I'm not sure on the first accident, Senator. I'd have to go back and have a look. The second accident, which is still subject to the investigation, I think the pilot had just over 530 hours.
Yeah.
So yeah, more. 400 is less than that, but it is, for us, it's a question of experience, and that's where the 500 comes in. And if I may make a point, if I look across at the angel flight organisations across the world, if I look at the 7 angel flight organisations in the United States, for example, because I'm often encouraged to harmonise my regulations with the FAA. If I look at just the angel flight organisations, a number of those are at 500 hours. Mm-hmm. They're nearly all at instrument flying. So they are nearly all much higher than the standards we're imposing here. So we're just lifting that minimum threshold.
Okay, because I'm looking at the pilot affirmation required for angel flight, and they say you must have at least 250 hours logged as a pilot in command.
Depends on which one, Senator. I've got. Which angel flight is that? It's beyond the top of the sheet, probably, because angel flight mid-Atlantic is 500.
I'm talking about the Australian operation.
Oh, the Australian is 250.
Yeah.
I was talking about the American one, so we're talking cross purposes.
Sure.
But what I suppose what I'm saying is, the point I was making, I think, or endeavouring to make, is that the minimum standard in angel flight elsewhere is much higher, voluntarily is much higher than the minimum standard that angel flight sets here in Australia. Mm-hmm. And we consider that pilot experience is a relevant factor. Most angel flight pilots have much more experience than 500 hours.
Sure.
So all we're doing is increasing the experience level at the bottom end.
Well, in actual fact, I think what you're doing is placing a minimum that I actually don't think will affect their operations, to be quite honest.
Nor do I. I think it would be so minor. I really just don't see how it would affect them.
So in that area, I don't have a problem. As you know, the other day I had a big problem with the helicopters. Mm-hmm. That leaves us moving to things like night VFR.
Yep.
So the general principle is, I as a person can jump into Senator Brockman's plane. I think you've got a licence, haven't you?
No, I did some pilot training, but I never got my licence.
All right, well, I'm not going to jump into his plane then, but we can jump into mine. I can jump in as a regular person into an aircraft with a pilot, with a certain level of comfort that this person knows how to fly, because CASA would not have given them a licence unless they were able to, and that includes for night VFR. So there's, these pilots if you're trained for night VFR, I'm trying to understand the distinction between a person who just a regular person and someone who might be an angel flight passenger. And just for the record, just for the chair and others who may be listening, angel flight is and these community service flights are used in circumstances where someone in a remote area, regional area, unfortunately finds out they've got cancer and needs some treatment and chemo, and that has to be done in my state in Adelaide, and it can be quite a burden to go from Ceduna to Adelaide multiple times, and so these pilots volunteer, pay their way, and Angel Flight provides a level of regulation, if you like, or not in the CASA sense, and also contributes to the cost of the fuel.
I think, just to clarify, I think Angel Flight brokers the activity, coordinates it. It has some rules around that.
Yeah.
Very minimal though, in comparison to, for example, the other community service flight operator, Little Wings, which operates as if it is an aircraft operator, operates as if it holds an air operator certificate. So it has systems in place and it has appointed people to manage that, whereas Angel Flight's view is that it brokers the activity and no more. So it does connect the patient or the passenger with a volunteer pilot, but not extensively more than that.
And in that sense, the nature of the discussion is if these regulations come into force and, in this case, might exclude someone who would normally be able to fly me from Ceduna to Adelaide night VFR, but under the new regulations would exclude a friend of mine who's got cancer from jumping into the same aircraft and making the same trip.
I think I understand the point that you're making. I do think that Angel Flight indicates that they've got, I think, about 3,000 pilots on their books, give or take. They do reimburse the cost of fuel, and anecdotally, if not more than anecdotally, people fly with Angel Flight as much for the good that they're doing as it is for someone paying for their hours.
Yeah.
And there are always there are lots of pilots, if you like, competing for jobs, if I can put it that way, when a job comes up. So I'd argue that there would be, in the majority of circumstances, pilots around. I think the night VFR connection relates to the first accident too, which is the accident in Nil, in Victoria, which was 2011, I think, where it was essentially an accident under night visual flight rules. I understand the pilot was qualified to fly night VFR, but night VFR is a risky activity, and what we're really endeavouring to do here, if I may, is to reduce the risk. And if I link back to what I said before, we spent a lot of time working with Angel Flight over the last 18 months to encourage them to voluntarily do what some of the other Angel Flights are doing, to raise their standards, voluntarily push them up, because we think there is risk, and unfortunately we were not successful.
Yeah, look, in some sense, I don't really want to go to Angel Flight. I'm just trying to understand. You've got someone who is qualified to fly night VFR. I can go to that person and say to that person in a private nature, there's two of us in the plane, how about we split the cost of this journey? I believe that's lawful. Yep. So I can pitch in for the fuel, pitch in for some of the maintenance costs, pitch in for whatever other costs might be involved in the flight, and that's fine. So, Senator Patrick goes off on his flight, but my colleague who's ill, same pilot, same aircraft. In this instance, someone is paying for assisting with the cost of the fuel, can't. And I just wonder how you differentiate between, I'm probably less valuable than that person, but between two people in exactly the same circumstances from a safety perspective.
Okay. Well, it's... the safety perspective.
You're kind of arguing duty of care perspective.
Certainly duty of care. Certainly knowing that there are opportunities. I mean, that last accident case, the drift into night VFR, I think, was a consequence of late appointments and what have you. So it was and sometimes this happens in the community service flight sector, where someone's flying into the city for an appointment. The appointment gets delayed, something happens, and then they're under pressure to get back. And in this case, I think it was a drift into night VFR, but it ran out of time. What we're trying to do is, and the pilot would be saying, well, I'm still qualified, so I'll fly in night VFR. I've been flying all day, but I'll keep on flying. We're looking for human factors, decision making, to say maybe I shouldn't fly night VFR. But
that doesn't vary from person A to person B.
It does, in the sense that you know your mate. So you've done a deal with your mate, you know your mate's appetite.
That doesn't tell me anything about his flight qualifications.
Well, but you do know his appetite for risk.
I'd like to table the documentation, which is the Angel Flight request documentation, if that's okay.
It's also really an issue that suddenly, Senator, suddenly the flight has become more complex.
Sure.
Significantly more complex
Sure.
than it was planned to be. And you've got ill passengers in the back. You've got people
No, they're
who are
not
unwell.
ill passengers.
Well, they can.
Well,
They very often are, Senator. with respect.
Yeah,
They're not being treated, but in that sense.
I think Senator Patrick does make a very good point, though, that in terms of the safety profile, I'm not convinced you've made.
I'll ask one of my colleagues to come in and see if he can give me some assistance.
And Chair, Chair, just so everyone's aware of what I've tabled, is the Angel flight request documentation. It has a fact sheet in there.
Happy to table.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Has a fact sheet in there, instructions, there is a guidelines for referrers, medical clearances, passenger guidelines, waivers and release of liability, and I'm informed, and I have no reason to doubt this, that before you can jump on one of these flights as a person seeking to fly to Adelaide to have chemo, you've also have to have watched a video that takes you through the process and talks you through the risks of what it is that you're getting into. And so the duty of care thing is in some sense negated by the fact that you've got someone who's had to sign up to a waiver, they've read through the fact, they've watched a video, they're kind of going in with eyes open.
Senator, the document, what the document doesn't say is that in Angel Flight's case, for example, according to our statistics, there's a significantly higher risk of accident or incident flying with Angel Flight.
I'm going to ask you
privately.
to ask you to table evidence that grounds that statement. I can't.
Senator, I'm going to say we have done our calculations that lead us to that conclusion. But if I may, I'd ask that you that I'm not sure that even though we've done our work, that everybody will agree with it. But I'm quite happy to table it. Or quite happy to do it on notice, but I'd ask that you also take notice of the ATSB's work, because they will have done much more definitive work on this risk as part of their analysis. I don't have the benefit of the draft report for the Mount Gambier flight. Well, the only thing that I would say, Senator, is I've not read anything thus far which would make me change my opinion. If I can put it that way. I can't say any more.
Well, I understand that. Actually, protected by privilege, but I won't press the issue. But so that therein lies my problem, and the chair's sort of picked up on it. Is that if you then start to impose additional rules, and I don't have a problem with the hours because actually they all have that anyway, so it doesn't act to deter. But we may have a situation, you've got a person who is qualified to fly night VFR, they can fly Rex Patrick when he's contributing partly to the fees, who hasn't signed a waiver, hasn't looked at any of this stuff, but kind of likes the person who's flying them. I've had a few drinks with them from a few weeks ago or something. You've got a person who probably needs the flight more than what I do, and has signed a waiver, goes and fully open the same flight, same aircraft, same qualifications, and there's now a risk that a pilot who is night VFR qualified flies into Adelaide is going to get delayed. That's additional cost to him or her. And for no apparent safety reason from their perspective. I mean, I'm sure a pilot would not fly if they didn't feel like it was safe. But can you see my point?
I see your point. I'll ask my colleague to address it if I may, Senator.
Chris Monahan, Executive Manager for National Ops and Standards, CASA. I'd like to kind of refine the question. The night VFR, as far as I know, there's no community service flight organization that allows night VFR right now in country. But the opportunity is, in the case of night VFR, you have the ability to fly a qualified aircraft and a qualified pilot into a regime where you're no longer qualified by losing discernible horizon at night. If you're an IFR aircraft and an IFR pilot, then you're, in theory, able to manage all the weather, so you're fully qualified through the entire part of the flight. So if you lose discernible horizon, you're supposed to basically come back to a place where you can fly night VFR. to the discussion of why you can fly with him, but you can't fly, because we can't guarantee you're going to be matched up with somebody you know. So the system is very big and broad.
But knowing someone is not a test.
Excuse me?
Knowing Senator Brockman, I think he's a fine chap. Look, I did a flight around. The Condamine just recently, and I turned up and I just jokingly said to the pilot, are you a student pilot or not? Just as my own safety check. And he said, look, no, I'm a commercial pilot. But he looked like he was 18. What made me get on that flight was, on face value, I've accepted his statement he's a commercial pilot, was that I know CASA won't give him a licence until he's reached a particular standard.
I understand that, but the unique nature and the
I didn't know the pilot at all. And if we're at a friend of mine, I'd say, have you got a licence? Senator Brockman just said no, so that actually stops the whole thing.
Hope so.
But had he said, yeah, I've got a licence and I've got, I'd probably ask him how many hours he's got. He says he's got 250 hours. I'd go, okay, well, let's do it. Now that's a less of a check than what's required for, or less. I'm less informed than what someone who might jump on an Angel flight would be.
Well, we've seen that. We've actually seen the Angel flight documentation because we have it, but it's and we have a slightly different view then, because our view is that even through that you don't really have necessarily a meaningful understanding of the risks. You don't know statistically that it's 4 or 5 times less safe to fly with Angel flight than it is to fly with your mate.
I think you need to ground that.
I'm sure that will,
statement.
but I'm confident that will. They've had 2 fatal accidents, in the last 10 years, gone over 10 years. They've had a number of other accidents. They had a wheels up 2 weeks ago, if you recall, in Wagga, and they've had a number of other incidents. So statistically, our numbers show that they are less safe. That doesn't quite come through in the documentation. There is stuff about risk. I haven't seen the video. My colleagues might have, but it's a meaningful understanding of what the risk is.
Yeah, and I know we've had a previous discussion about this, Mr. Carmody, but you take one of those incidents out of the mix, and it potentially Angel flights would, community service flights would be safer.
So no, I can't take the incident out of the mix because it happened. It's like me taking Lion Air crash out of the mix.
Statistics. You've got to look at statistical significance as well.
I understand the point you're making, Senator, but I suppose the point that I'm making is that the accident did happen. We look at statistics across all sectors of the industry. I look at statistics for aerial agricultural flights and how effective they are, and the numbers aren't great, but the numbers are there. We look at all statistics, and Angel Flight has had those 2 accidents, and we put it over. We run over 10 years, not over the last 6. I think that if you just counted the 2 outliers, it'd actually be higher. I'm not a good statistician, but I think the numbers would be higher. But the point is the events did occur, and as I said, we could be having a discussion about international low-cost carriers, and we could exclude Lion Air from 3 months ago. I mean, the numbers are there. The events have occurred, and the statistics show what they show, and what they show us is that there are more incidents in that space now. Should I take those incidents out? I don't know. I wouldn't take them out statistically. One of the points in this the instrument that I signed a few weeks ago is to make sure that all community service flights are in future declared as such, because at the moment they are not. They prefer to just categorise themselves as private flights, so no one knows really what the statistics are. But we've done our own analysis on the flights, and we've come up with a higher number. And if I understand it correctly, part of the investigation from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau was to get information from Angel Flight. So they did their own numbers.
So when are those statistics going to be available?
Well, once the Australian Transport Safety Bureau completes its report, which I assume, I can't speak to them, but I would say 6 weeks or so, is normally about the time, 6 to 8 weeks is normally about the time. When they go out into the final consultation phase with families and interested parties, it's checking detail and then it's finalising. So they are not that far away, is my point. Patrick?
Yeah, okay, so I'm presuming if you have to declare that you're a CSF, then you have to, a community service flight, that's a ticking of a box somehow, is it?
It's a ticking of a box, so it would be
there's no burden in that.
It would be declaring a SAR time in the aircraft, and it would be logging it in your logbook, so that statistically over a period of time, then we'll know which ones are community service flights and which ones are not, which is, as I said, has been quite a difficulty for us because we've been relying on figures provided by the organisations plus our own analysis.
So if you had to do a leg to get to a pickup point and then a leg to a destination and then a leg home, are all 3 legs community service?
I don't know. I'd have to ask my colleagues. I'm not a
The
pilot.
intent is if you're going to be reimbursed by the CSF, in that case, yes, because that goes under that construct.
That's
In
right.
the case which you mentioned earlier of the night VFR concern, we thought about your concern about that closing off any opportunities for people. One, we considered that because they have thousands of pilots available to them if they plan weeks and months in advance, and they know they might be having a schedule time that brings them up against night. At last report in their 2011 mishap, what they reported, they had 61%, I think, were IFR-rated pilots. So good opportunity for people who are cleared to fly at night, so they could pre-plan and get somebody in there with an aircraft that could support that. But
I'd love to have a pilot that's IFR-rated or a commercial airline pilot that's doing the flight. I'd love that. That'd make me feel even safer probably. But once again, it goes to the safety. If you've got a night VFR qualified pilot, I mean, they've got the CASA stamp that says they are safe to fly from A to B at night under VFR conditions. And what my major concern here is that you're putting in place regulations that, if they're safety based, I've got no problem with that. Hence the pilot hours. But if, for example, there are additional maintenance requirements where a pilot's going to say, well, if we're going to do this flight, I'm going to have to book my inspection, 3 months earlier or 1 month earlier, and that's going to cost me a couple of $1,000 before I can even qualify to do this flight. It may, and once again, that aircraft could otherwise be used to fly me from A to B, not as a passenger. If it deters people from engaging in this community service that helps people out, helps people in regions out, because boy, they do it tough. That's where I have a problem. So look, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm going to ask you to, and once again, I'll say that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Privacy Acts of the ATSB, the secrecy associated with the ATSB is subservient to the inquiry powers of the Senate, but I say that giving you the opportunity to correct me. In the case of both Mount Gambier and the Melbourne, the Moorabbin, I think, wasn't it? The first accident, flight, yeah.
The first accident was nil. I think, in Victoria, and the second was Mount Gambier.
And in both of those cases, having done an inspection would not have done anything in terms of changing the outcome of those flights because they were not maintenance related.
Oh, that's correct, Senator.
Okay, so can you, as you're going to table some statistics so that they can be reviewed by people, and I'm sure Angel Flight will have their interest in it, we'll have our interest in it, and so forth, that grounds your claim here in this committee that they are less safe. And I'd like you, as you're doing that, where there is some problem that has occurred in your analysis, perhaps annotate next to it and say, our new regulation would have prevented that from occurring.
Senator, as I've said in the broad, and I understand what you've requested. As I said in the broad, this is about.
You're happy to do that, Mr. Cameron?
This is about raising the threshold. I would prefer to ensure that the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's accident investigation report, which will be much more thorough than the work we do in this space, is out. At the same time,
but you've said you've done
convergent
the
with that.
statistics.
Oh, we've done our statistics.
Yeah.
But the issue of maintenance is less of a statistical issue, if I may. Private aircraft fly approximately 50 hours a year. That's all. So there's a threshold that says every 12 months you'll have your aircraft
Now, hang
inspected.
on, that average includes me who doesn't fly very often, as opposed to the people who are quite experienced.
Quite, but the BITRA standard says that private aircraft fly an average of 50 hours a year. It's 50, isn't it?
Yes.
When we consider these activities, community service flight activities, we've categorised them as private activities, but they're on the cusp of commercial activities in the sense that the reality is that people are receiving funding payment for them. So in a technical sense, they're on the cusp. We put them in the private category because we know that, and we also know that the aircraft aren't operated that much. When you start to move into layers above these activities, above private activities, you add more. There is more complexity, and there are more requirements. There is more maintenance. There is more training as you move up from the private to the commercial, through all the way up to regular public transport. We add more and more layers. With the case of something like the 100-hour maintenance issue, because we did propose a much more stringent maintenance regime, and we listened to what was said in the feedback, and we reduced that maintenance regime significantly in the final instrument.
Yeah, that's the equivalent of saying we could have been even worse, but we're not.
No. Well, I suppose what I'm
how
saying
does
is
it make it safer?
What I'm saying is we consulted and we listened to what people said, that those maintenance requirements would be too onerous. It makes it safer because it catches the outriders. The people who get caught in the above 100 hours are the ones I want to catch, Senator. The people who are flying their aircraft for 300 hours are the ones I want to catch, because they're using their aircraft a lot more than the average. They're the ones, and there won't be very many of them.
But they're going to be more experienced.
But this is not about experience. Your question is about maintenance.
Okay, well,
so it's how often the aircraft is
okay,
used,
sure.
and so the 12-hour, 12-month thing, the 100 hours and the 12 months is pretty much a standard. Can I ask
we're
Mr. Moran
back to
say
same
something?
person, it's the same pilot, same aircraft.
I'm not sure how the aircraft becomes less safe if I jump in as a community service passenger versus someone who has just met Senator Patrick.
What I'm saying is it's statistically less safe because there are more accidents and incidents in that sector brokered by people than there are in
You have to
private
ground.
flying.
You have to ground that properly with evidence.
The maintenance.
And
if I
can I
may.
just tell you the strategy that my party has done in terms of lodging a disallowance? We've lodged a disallowance in the House. That's really just to send a signal so that people would, can be prepared and present their case. I will do the same in the Senate when it returns on the 2nd of April. I don't want to disallow something, but you've got to make your case. You've got to, you are the safety authority. You are introducing a regulation that you say is centred around safety. I can't quite see it as it stands. You've now basically said it comes down to the statistics. You are concerned that Angel Flight have more incidents than the regular
than
private pilots.
Than private flying.
I want to see those statistics and see how these regulations would have altered those statistics back into the, to get it back into the same place we are with just normal pilot
We're concerned at both the incidents, and I'm concerned at the two fatal accidents too, and I don't want to see another one.
Yeah, sure.
No
one does, but you can't then change make a set of regulations that don't relate to those two flights.
I think, Senator, if I may make one observation, and that is that of the 200 odd responses that we received to our consultation, a significant number of those were Angel Flight pilots themselves. That's a relevant consideration. And just over 50% of those Angel Flight pilots said no change is required. But close to 50%, in the high 40s, said something needs to be done here. They're people who operate in that sector. Those responses are published on our website. They are visible. So what I'm saying is that I've got a range of very experienced Angel Flight people who come up with a similar view. I've also got people who disagree with the view. But some of the people who disagree with the view disagree with any form of regulation, Senator. So they would disagree with whatever I told them.
Now, I'm sure AOPA is listening, and I'm sure that Angel Flight are listening, and I'm sure that they will make a submission to, or they'll write to the committee, and my message to them will be the same. Ground any claims you make with evidence. And the nice thing is we've got estimates in 6 weeks' time. Hopefully, no, I'm serious about that. Luckily,
I'm looking forward to it.
Lovely reminder. At 5:10 on a spillover day on a Friday.
I'm trying to finish off. I'm just saying,
if you haven't had enough yet,
let's have a
there's more to
relook
come.
at this in 6 weeks' time, with your evidence on the table and with the evidence of the anyone else who wants to make a contribution.
Could I say, Senator, that's fine. Understand everything that you've said. I would make the point, however, that as a Director of Aviation Safety, my responsibility is to keep Australians safe. They're the decisions that I make, that the government's empowered me to do and wants me to do, based on the evidence that I have. And I've made those decisions, and it's up to the Parliament if the Parliament wishes to disallow. I get that, I understand that
And
process
I'm a senator
completely.
who wants to make sure that people who rely on these flights to get medical treatment do so also safely, but not at, there's always a balance to be had here. And I'm just not sure it's right.
There is certainly a balance, Senator, and
we can make it completely safe by banning everyone from flying, and there will be no accidents.
And that's certainly not our intent, which is why, as you know, why I listened to what was said with Rotary Wing and said that was not my intention
And I thank you
to
for
limit the field. My intention was to make sure that these activities occur. But we are in the precautionary space. I cannot prevent 2 accidents that occurred. I cannot do that. What I can do is raise standards to prevent the next accidents occurring. What I can do, I can't do any more with organisations like Angel Flight than encourage them to raise their standards, because I cannot get them to do anything else because they are not subject to my regulatory oversight. I can only encourage them to raise their standards. I've done that.
You
over the
gave
last
every one
18
of their
months.
pilots a licence, Mr. Carmody.
Oh no, but they would say they are not, with respect, Senator, they would say they are not their pilots.
Okay, sure.
So-
I'm done, Chair. And thank you very much for your time,
My
Mr.
pleasure.
Carmody.
And I think just following up what Senator Patrick said, and I think the reason why we are both concerned about these regulations is because we've heard from the general aviation sector over a long period of time that they feel like they are being squeezed out of existence by the level of regulation they face. And as Senator Patrick said, we could make things a lot safer if everybody stopped flying, but I don't think that's where any of us want to be. So do appreciate your time today. Just a really quick one, complaints about drones. You've received a complaint that we received as well about the difficulty of reporting a drone in, I believe it was controlled airspace. They were on the phone for half an hour, had to ring back.
Senator, I'm not familiar with the actual complaint. One of my colleagues might, but we do get a lot of complaints. We do a lot of prosecutions on drones. Are you familiar with that particular one?
I don't want to read the name out into the public record, but
If I could get it later.
It's clearly been sent to you as well as to this committee.
Some days it's a growth industry with people trying to call and make complaints like that, which we encourage people to do because that gives us more data to work with when we get reliable sightings and work through it. Certainly, we wouldn't want anybody to wait that long. If I can get the details afterwards, we can try to run it to ground because we don't want anybody to wait that
I'll get
long.
the
We'll work out what
Secretariat
happened.
to get in
Certainly.
touch.
No, and it's
And if you could give us a little bit of feedback on that, that would be
certainly take that on notice.
excellent. On that note then, Mr Carmody.
Thank you, Chair.
We thank you all for your time. We thank all witnesses who appeared today. Ms Spence, I think you got off pretty lightly. Don't want to throw a couple of questions at Ms Spence, Senator Patrick?
Actually, I'll just use the opportunity. I've thought about this guide here. I think I've declared on the Hansard now that I've got this
Yeah,
free of
visual
charge
flight guide.
from visual flight guide from CASA. I think that covers me off.
It's done.
Thank you.
All right, Minister Mackenzie, Minister Colbeck from earlier, all the witnesses all the officials who have appeared today, thank you. Thanks Hansard and Broadcasting. Thank you to the Secretariat. And on that, we adjourn.